Now recently I've been on a bit of a quest to try and make photography feel a bit more exciting, to try and regain some of that enthusiasm and, more importantly, just keep the image making process fun, both in terms of taking photos and in the subsequent photos themselves. I want to get excited about what I'm seeing. And it's been a pretty successful mission so far, and today I'm going to share a tip and a way of shooting that I think is going to definitely help you take more photos. And not just more photos, but more photos that you're going to be excited about. Sometimes I wish I could go back to being a beginner photographer, because I've been a photographer for many, many years now. And at the beginning, whenever you start anything new, like photography, then those gains, those improvements, those marginal gains, I suppose you could call them, they come much thicker and much faster, you know. It's like you improve so much in such a short space of time, but as time goes on, those improvements and those marginal gains become slightly harder to actually recognize. And what that means is that sometimes we can go for long periods of time without feeling like we're really doing anything differently and creating anything differently. And sometimes it's just about changing your perspective and trying new creative things that are not the norm for you. That can be really transformative. And that's something that I want to talk about today, just a really simple technique, a simple process that completely changes how you see the scenes that you want to photograph.
If I see a scene that interests me, that enthusiasm to start shooting and pick up my camera happens almost immediately. And I think that's a good thing. It's important to notice the things that actually interest you. But turning on the camera and immediately starting to compose the image is a mistake, or at least it was for me. Now, depending on your camera, and if you shoot full frame like I do, the standard aspect ratio will likely be 3:2, and that varies depending on the sensor that you have. And I shoot 3:2 quite often. It's got plenty of width, it's got plenty of height, making it versatile for a variety of different scenes and subjects. And whilst you can shoot a lot of things at 3:2, just because it's versatile, it doesn't mean that it's always the best aspect ratio to use. And the real joy of photography, and what I find enjoyable about it, is finding the right aspect ratio to present the scene and the location that I'm shooting.
So I've met up with my friend Scott Edwards today, fellow photography YouTuber. I will link his channel down in the description. And we've decided to come and explore some of the slate quarries in the hills around Snowdonia National Park, around Eryri. We are currently in Carmarthen, heading up to Rossyth Quarry, somewhere that I've been before, somewhere that Scott hasn't been before, but I've never actually got to the top, to the actual barracks and the quarry workings up at Rossyth. So that's hopefully the plan today. We're going to try, get some elevation in, get to the top, and explore this really fascinating landscape. I mean, the quarry here, I think the initial working started in like the 1830s, and it was pretty prosperous for many, many decades. And I think by the 1900s, it had fallen into some financial hard times, and I think there was a big underground collapse in some of the tunnels, which kind of plagued it with all kinds of problems. And then I think it eventually closed in 1948. So this landscape has been abandoned for over 70 years now. Now, in the past, I've been guilty of adopting somewhat of a fix-it-in-post mentality to my image making. I think because of the advancements in camera sensors and camera technology, as well as improvements in editing software, there's now so many pixels to work with that I guess the consequence of not getting everything perfect in camera is slightly more inconsequential. And as a result of that, I would often shoot in 3:2, and then if I wanted to reframe or recompose my image, I could just crop it in post. But I found that by doing that, I was actually robbing myself of a really crucial and creative, and for me, enjoyable part of the image making process. I think seeing how an aspect ratio completely transforms the scene in front of you and how your composition looks and how your composition feels It's something that's really important for all photographers to experience. It will bring your photography on leaps and bounds. And at the end of the day, why wait until you get home to create the perfect photo? So I've just made it up to the chapel in the valley here at Cwmorthin, which would have been used to serve the community, the families, the workers of the quarry itself. But I was only here taking photos literally back in the autumn, like October, November time last year. And seeing how it's changed in that short space of time, you might be able to see one of the big windows, the arches, you know, one of those has fallen through. I'll put some photos up of when I was here last, so you can see the difference, but it just further, I guess, cements the fact that these places need to be captured and photographed and revisited while we still can, because, you know, this is the history of the Welsh landscape here. It's the history of Welsh culture, and it's definitely not going to be here forever. So I'm glad I'm making trips back here to, yeah, see how it's changing. So I'm going to try and get a photo of the chapel from this perspective, just trying to capture some of the I guess the rubble falling and how the actual structure of the chapel has changed. And here, you know, aspect ratio is really important because there's a lot of different ways that you can approach this in terms of how you compose and frame the shot. But I'm going to use the kind of X-Pan panoramic crop, which is, I think, 65 by 24. So a really, really narrow field of view, but very, very wide, because here everything is kind of on the same plane. You know, the height of the trees kind of matches the height of the sloping valleys, and I want to get the width in this shot because you can then see the quarry workings that the chapel was built for. You can see the chapel itself. You get the slate walls that are leaning into the frame. So, you know, that's a really important creative choice, and being able to make that choice in the field, I think it's really important. So I'm shooting this at around 35mm, f8, 80th of a second. Yeah, I think it works really well.
Making that choice in the field, taking the time to carefully choose the most appropriate aspect ratio, will in the long run lead to you taking more photos, because the reason that we often don't take the photo is because we feel like the composition doesn't work, when in fact it might just be a case of we're not using the right aspect ratio to make the composition feel balanced or to make it feel the way that we want it to.
Now behind this gate is the ascent up to Rosyth Quarry, and it looks pretty steep, and I've not had lunch yet, so definitely going to take a breather before tackling that. But whilst I do that, I thought I'd, I guess, explain the importance of aspect ratio for me in terms of my creative process. And I think the trouble is, with the advancement in camera tech these days, you know, we are far less engaged with the image making process. Nowadays, it doesn't really matter how we take the photo. You know, if you've overexposed it slightly, you can retain the highlights. If you've underexposed it, you can lift the shadows. If your horizon isn't straight, you can correct it. And all that means is that now we can literally just fire the shutter without even thinking about it. I equate it similarly to taking the time to cook your favourite meal, only to wolf it down as fast as possible. You know, you want to savour it, you want to enjoy the experience. And I think that's something that I'm mindful of now in my photography. You know, taking the time to think about the aspect ratio, how I want to present the scene in front of me, that is me savouring the scene. And I think that will definitely lead to just a better experience when out in the field. You know, take your time. For the most part, we have plenty of it when we're taking the time to come out with our cameras. Anyway, I suppose I should tackle this hill now. The steep climb up the trail led to a few instances where I had to stop and catch my breath, and during one of these moments I was looking back down the valley and the scene was just really beautiful. The light was casting some nice contrast and making the colours pop, and you could see the chapel and the pine trees and the Cwmorthin quarry in the distance, and I really wanted to capture the scene. But shooting it wide at 3x2 or 16x9
was just too wide. Most of the interest is near the middle of the scene. If you think about the chapel, the pine tree, the white house, which is the bothy of Cumorthing Quarry, and the actual trail leading up to the lake, everything is fairly centrally weighted. So by choosing a square crop, it allows me to capture all the things that are important in the composition whilst getting rid of all the stuff that isn't. And I think that's where aspect ratio and framing is so important. Sometimes we don't have to fit everything into the scene. We have to choose the things that are important to the scene and remove all the other distractions to give those subjects and those focal points enough visual weight and balance.
Wow, so that was a pretty brutal climb, but the views are just absolutely stunning. And we've made it now to the Rosyth Quarry, which is a good place for a bit of a lunch stop. I mean, there are definitely worse places to eat your lunch, aren't there? Currently just taking a bit of a breather before exploring this kind of like really vast plateau. But because we're at such a high elevation now, you can also start to see some of the distant peaks, and it just kind of changes the landscape a little bit, which, you know, is going to change the photography, even though the subject matter is kind of the same. But yeah, these old ruins are just so fascinating, and there's bits of machinery, engines, chassis, just all sorts of different things to take photos of. So yeah, it's time to finish this banana and get exploring. Now, I think the reason that I didn't used to use aspect ratios when I was out shooting was purely because of the faff of menus, especially on my Sony camera. Sorry, Sony. But, you know, having to go through menus whilst you're out in the field, faffing with settings, it does take you out of the photo making process. And that's why I think it's so important to take the time to configure your camera to work for you. And the best way to configure your camera is a very, you know, personal choice. How I have mine set up is I have my aspect ratios available at a quick selection menu. So I can literally scroll through them whenever, you know, I'm out shooting, and it doesn't take me out of the actual experience of taking photos. And just taking that time to set up some custom buttons and think about how to configure your shots will, you know, make you a much more efficient photographer, and it gives you freedom to then explore some of these things in the field. So the thing that I am struggling with a little bit this afternoon is that the light is never kind of really where I want it to be. And with the slate landscape and photographing these old abandoned slate structures, you really do need that light to add contrast, because everything is just kind of middle grey otherwise. So to kind of get around that, I'm looking for other elements, other subjects in the landscape to add some of that contrast. And here we've got these old barracks, but there's a lot of metalwork and machinery, old scaffolding, that's this really rusty colour. And it's a rusty colour, I guess, because it's rust. And here I'm just trying to compose this scene and thinking about aspect ratio, because it's, you know, it's covering a wide space, but it's not super wide. And obviously this pole is a very strong vertical. So all I'm doing is I'm trying to compose the pole so it actually intersects a break in the wall, so it shouldn't interrupt the composition too much. And there's obviously the distant mountain, which I really want to get in the shot, because again, it adds a bit of context to the location. And I really enjoy the foreground as well. There's some really, really nice texture, some nice colour. Some of this slate has got lots of like moss and algae growing on it. So because of that, I do need height and I need a little bit of width. So I've chosen 4x3, and yeah, it's working really nicely. I'm going to try and wait for the light, see if anything happens. But yeah, I'll put the best one up on screen.
I think while some of the photos would have benefited from different conditions, different lighting, different weather, I don't feel like there have been any scenes that I've photographed that I haven't enjoyed compositionally. Framing and composition haven't really been an issue today, and whilst I have had to work hard for certain scenes to find that balance and find the right aspect ratio, there haven't really been any compositions that I've had to walk away from. I've always found a way to creatively compose them. And there's one final thing that I just want to mention about shooting with aspect ratios applied in camera that is really important. So just stick around for a few more minutes for this really important tip.
So one thing that you need to be aware of if you are looking to shoot with your aspect ratios selected in camera is it's worth checking whether that is destructive or not to the RAW file. Thankfully with the Lumix S5 II, shooting in RAW, whatever aspect ratio I choose is basically just adding a frame to the sensor. It's not actually changing the image sensor and therefore the aspect ratio. So when I add this photo into Lightroom, for example, I actually get the full 3:2, and I can choose whether to use the crop I've applied or just use the standard sensor size. So just gives you a little bit more freedom to make some of these creative decisions, you know, in the field, knowing that if you don't like them when you get home, you know, you've not ruined your photo, basically.
So that was a really enjoyable day at Carmarthen and Rosyth. Thanks so much to my friend Scott Edwards for joining me on a nice photo adventure. Be sure to subscribe to Scott's channel down in the description below. So as with everything that I share on this channel, I'm not telling you that this is what you should do, it's just about sharing ideas. So hopefully there's a few things you can take away from this video. Maybe just an aspect ratio that you've seen me use that you haven't tried yourself that you might want to have a go with, or just thinking more about how you interact with your camera and really savour the experience of being out shooting. Getting more stuff right in camera does lead to a much more immersive photography experience. Sitting at home at a desk just isn't quite as enjoyable, if you ask me. So thanks so much for watching. New episode of the Caffeinated Camera Club podcast will be out this Sunday. Thanks for all the support that you've shown with the podcast so far. Glad to hear that you've been enjoying some of the episodes. Like I said, it's just a place that I use to further share ideas and give you guys some things to think about in between these main videos that I shoot and share on the channel. So until next week, take care, get out with the camera, try some of these aspect ratios, and as always, I'd love to hear from you guys down in the comments. Right, take care folks.